welcome everybody to this latest edition of the Loren Eiseley Public Forum, a series of discussions and visitations on the author Loren Eiseley, sponsored by the Loren Eiseley Society. So I welcome each and every one of you in attendance. My name is Bing Chen, and I'm the current president of the Loren Eiseley Society. I welcome each of you. First, I'd like to introduce also another member of our board of directors, George Engelman, who is a paleontologist, just retired from the University of Nebraska. And George has been kind enough to accompany me on a number of expeditions to the Wildcat Hills, where Loren Eiseley cut his teeth on paleontology. And so look forward to having George perhaps give a future presentation to this assembled group. And Tom Lynch is the vice president of the Loren Eiseley Society. And Tom is the organizer for these public forums. So I will ask Tom to make introductions of our speaker this afternoon. Tom?
Thanks, Bing. As some of you may have gathered from our chit chat, Anthony and I have known each other for quite a while. I was trying to think if it was 25, 30 years.
Something like that.
Something like that. We're getting old, aren't we? As professional colleagues meeting at conferences regularly, and then chatting on social media, keeping in touch the rest of the time. So I'll give a kind of formal introduction to Anthony here. He's an associate professor of liberal arts and English at Juilliard School in New York City. At Juilliard, he teaches courses in the liberal arts core and academic writing, as well as advanced electives on literary ecology, which is our meeting point, new media, medievalism, religion and science, and postmodernism. His scholarship centers on the fields of contemporary American literature, eco-criticism, cultural studies, and rhetoric and composition. He's published dozens of articles in journals and book chapters, including several on Loren Eiseley. In 2016, he published Nerd Ecology, Defending the Earth with Unpopular Culture, which covers topics such as Star Wars and J.R.R. Tolkien. I've always told people Lord of the Rings is the great Anthropocene novel. And he's past president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment. This forum was sort of triggered because some of you, if you follow our Facebook postings regularly, Anthony had posted that he had recently visited Eiseley's archives at Penn University of Pennsylvania, and posted a few things, and it seemed to generate a lot of interest. People were curious about what he'd found there, including those of us in the society. So I will now turn it over to Anthony.
Thank you, Tom, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Bing, and to all the other conveners. I'm very happy and honored to be here. As Tom has already explained, Loren Eiseley, Loren Eiseley was really like the thing that got me into the professional field of eco-criticism. So, you know, there's a kind of origin story here. And in fact, like I wound up encountering him first when I was in high school on a kind of ecology boot camp on an island in Maine, and the organizers, who were professors from Case Western University, sat us around a campfire in the middle of the night and read the Star Thrower to us from beginning to end, right? So that's like my little origin myth for what it's worth. So I just wanted to say that I have prepared a few points to talk about, but I really hope that we get into a discussion. And because I'm bad at multitasking, if people post questions in the chat, I will not see them. So please feel free to just interrupt. I can't see everybody's squares on Zoom either. So again, feel free to interrupt, and I'll pause and ask after each point to see if anybody wants to engage. because you don't want me talking for 45 minutes right straight. So I thought I would skip to the end, like to the most important conclusion that I reached, having actually visited the archives for the first time, which is that in consultation with this very, very kind archivist, I concluded that the thing about this collection is that it needs to be digitized, right? Like, and I'm, the librarian himself, Tim Horning, he's the one who brought that up, and I immediately agreed once I actually opened the boxes, because on the one hand, right, the materials are very well preserved, right? So there are many materials that are like 70 years old, 50 years old, 40 years old, and the paper materials, even the newspaper and the magazines, right? I was just allowed to touch them with my hands, right, which is unusual in an archive because they really are in excellent shape. Like you can tell that they're being held in a climate controlled environment and so on. But that's not going to last forever. So there's the question of preservation of the collection, but also, and I think more immediately, the question of access, right? So as a professional scholar, I'm a big open access person. I want everything to be digitized and free, right? But the archivist and I were talking about this, and he said that there are basically two problems. In terms, like, he is willing to take on that project, right? But he would need a grant, right? And he would need to demonstrate interest. And I think that might be where the society comes in, because one of the things that he said was that it was, and I didn't know this before I went, he said that there are lots of inquiries about the Eiseley collection that they get by email, but not many people actually visit physically. And I think Penn, like the Penn archives and the people who are in charge of them, are a little old-fashioned in the sense that they actually value in-person visits, like as a measure of how important the collection is. And so Tim was really happy that I was, that I was going to arrive and stay for 2 whole days, because that was the beginning of demonstration of relevance. And I think it was also helpful that I ordered like 2/3 of the boxes, right, which is a lot of material. So that's my, for those of you who won't be able to stay until the end, right, that's the conclusion. Like, to me, what was important about the visit, above and beyond my own research, was that it revealed that there's a willingness on the part of the archivist to do a digitization project and to make it open access. But then the question becomes, how do you pay for that, and who the partners would be? And I should say right off that, unfortunately, like, I'm not in a position to be the primary investigator on that kind of grant, because I don't work at a liberal arts school, and therefore I'm actually forbidden to apply for a lot of the grants that could fund this kind of endeavor. So I'm just throwing that out there, right? That if somebody wants to develop a crack team to write a grant, and to collaborate with Tim Horning about digitizing this collection, I think that there's a great deal of interest for a variety of reasons, like not just to people who are interested in Loren Eiseley per se as a figure, as we all are, right? But people who do science and technology studies, all sorts of contemporary academic disciplines that I think this archive touches. And I'll talk a little bit more about why in a second. But does anybody, let me pause here in the first of the pauses to say, does anybody want to say anything or ask a question about that part?
I had a bit of a question in that I know that some amount of that material was copied by Gail Christensen when he did his biography, and that material was placed in the Heritage Room in the Lincoln Public Libraries. But I don't know how much of that material, and I don't know, Meredith has worked there. So do you know, Meredith?
There is quite a bit of material there, but it's paper.
Mhm. Yeah, it's not digitized, I know, but I'm just curious to know
A couple of
how
file
much might have been duplicated and be also
probably a
stored.
couple of file drawers full.
Mhm.
Quite a bit.
Okay, that might be worth investigating to see how much is there. Yeah. Yeah, I've never actually gone through that collection. I feel super guilty about it.
Well, neither had I, right?
Yeah.
I was telling Bing before everybody got here that like I've been intending to go to that archive since I was 26,
Mhm.
right? And so that was like 3 decades ago. So it's never too late. It's never too late, Tom.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I will say, just as a kind of FYI, is that for people who might want to go physically, I was under the wrong impression that the archive was actually at the Van Pelt Library, which is the main Penn library, and it's not. Um, it's not that far away, but it's in its own building, which I would never have found, right, if Tim Horning, the archivist, had not told me, right, don't go to the Van Pelt, right, that's not where we are. And then even when he told me where they were, they're on a second floor of a kind of visually undistinguished building near the campus, slightly off campus. And they're on the second floor, and they're really at the end of a maze, right? Like I really felt like I was going to meet the Minotaur at the end of the hallway, because it's sort of like you have to go right and then left and then left and then right and then left and then right, and there it is. And it was really hard to find even the second day when I had already been there. So there's something about that archive, right, which is both physically inaccessible, right, and just a little bit confusing, because I really did expect it to be at the main library.
Well, Anthony, I think I mentioned to you at some point that the rumor was amongst the Eiseley Society folks and maybe others that the archive was in horrible shape
Uh-huh.
and was really hard to work in. And that, I wonder if that didn't dissuade, it seems like that's not what you found, but
No.
that might have dissuaded people from going there.
So, like, I don't know. I do remember you saying that, and I one of my points was to address that. So thank you for that opportunity. I don't know what sort of standards people were using, but I mean, I'm used to archives. So, like, I've worked in the Library of Congress in DC, where literally I was opening boxes that hadn't been opened since the 19th century. And like there were just piles of papers everywhere, right? And you couldn't tell what they were until you looked at each individual sheet piece by piece. So that is absolutely not the state that the collection is in. I mean, I think that the fastest way to say this is Carolyn Workley's uh, guide is still accurate, right? Like in other words, I asked for boxes based on the guide that was available that she made, and like the materials that I found in each box corresponded to the descriptions in the guide. So that I mean that's one thing about, like, it's well organized in the sense that the finder system is still correct. The other thing is, I mean, the boxes sometimes have, if there's a lot of the same kind of stuff, then one box corresponds to, for instance, like all the correspondence about his honorary degrees. That's all in one box, right? But if there are sort of bits and pieces of smaller things, like sometimes the boxes do contain a variety of material, but usually that variety has already been noted in the finder. And there also is a physical finder inside the boxes themselves, right? Like you can actually like pull out, I felt a little nostalgic. I was like, oh, look, there's a written record of everything that's in the written record. So that was helpful too, although I didn't need it, because the description, the finder description that's actually on the web, right, in the archive page, is accurate as far as it goes. Now, and also, like I said, like nothing was scrunched up, everything was lying flat. It's all in folders, right? Like everything is really neatly labeled. So I don't know where that rumor came from, but by my standards, at least, like given other archives that I've seen, it actually is pretty well organized and accurate. Now, having said that, I will say there were some surprises. So, for instance, the Prairie Schooner issue devoted to Eiseley, the memorial Prairie Schooner issue. That, as far as I could tell, that's not listed anywhere in the Finder, but there is a hard copy in one of the boxes. And so I did come across objects like that where I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'm glad this is here, but I didn't know it was coming. Also, in terms of the title that that I gave to this forum, uh, there are, the end of the archive has some interesting Christmas cards, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there are surprises, right? But it wasn't what I would call disorganized. Does anybody have a sense of why that description stuck?
I just recall that some people who had visited it came away with the impression that it was not in very good shape. So, but like I said, you're right. I don't know how many archives they've been to and in bad shape relative to what, right?
No, so in
yeah.
better shape relative to the Library of Congress is pretty good.
Yeah, no, yeah. So,
like, and it's clear, like the archivists themselves recognize that this is a collection that has been accessed before. Like they didn't think that I was the first person to look at those boxes. And so given that those boxes have been taken apart and put back together, right, by other researchers, still the contents are accurate to the Finder. So I think that's the good news, right? And I mean, the well-preserved nature of the materials is also good news. I mean, honestly, I think that those materials could easily last, in the form that they're in because of the way they're stored, right, for decades, right? Like, it's not that anything is crumbling like it's an ancient papyrus scroll, right? It's not the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I was surprised that, like, I was looking at a newspaper from the bicentennial, right, the Philadelphia Inquirer, where Eiseley is one of the prominent Philadelphians who are asked to comment on the bicentennial, and his contribution was to me was unintentionally hilarious. But anyway, that newspaper, like, I could just unfold it and read it and turn the pages, and it wasn't crumbling and it wasn't torn, right? So I was surprised by that. And there are also clippings. There are newspaper clippings which should have been in worse shape than they were, but actually they're totally legible and in very good shape. So I was more concerned about, like, what I might do to disturb the archive, rather than what had already been done to it. So if anybody wants to talk about this idea of collaborating with Tim Horning on a digitization project, I think that would be like a worthy topic and a worthy effort. And by the way, I forgot to say, so right before this, I went to Facebook and I posted his email address and his name spelled out, right? If anybody wants to go to the Facebook page, and you'll find a record of that. And I can just repeat it now. His name is Tim Horning, Horn, like horn, ing, and his email address is T, his first initial, Horning, the whole last name. So T Horning at UPenn, N, right, .edu. That's it.
all right.
So he's
what comes to mind to me, Ant, is that we have at the university here the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities, which does this kind of work all the time.
awesome.
So they're really one of the premier digital humanities places in the world. So the idea might be to get them interested in it, right, as a project, maybe as somebody's MA thesis. I don't know how we would do it, but that's what occurs to me. Like a local author whose stuff is there, needs digitized, can they help? Yeah, they know how to do it, right? It's not just me scanning PDFs, right? They actually know how to make it searchable and all that good stuff. Yeah, they do the Whitman archives, right? So they've got a huge Whitman archive, and then they've got a Cather archive, for the two big ones that they've pretty much everything those two people ever produced has been digitized by them. So
that sounds really promising, Tom. So maybe we can talk about that afterwards. Yeah, I mean, there's enough material that it's definitely not something. It's not something to go at, right? If you've never done this before and you have no guidance, right? So, but the nice thing is that Tim wants to collaborate and is willing to do the work, but he's fairly young himself, and and he has a boss who has a boss, and he would need to convince them, right, that this was a good use of his time and had backing. So that the idea that he could collaborate, right, with a big time Nebraska uh, um, organization, right, like inside the university, to do that, I think would be perfect. Because he has his own institutional situation to deal with. But so having said that, maybe I should say uh, like what the highlights were for me, or like things that I think people would be interested in general, and then we can talk about it if people have questions. Many of you have already seen the correspondence between Annie Dillard and Rachel Carson and Loren Eiseley, and I mean, I should say more accurately, between Eiseley and Carson and Eiseley and Dillard. And what I would say about those, I mean, I posted some of those documents in the group, but what I would say about them is that there isn't very much there, but what is there is very interesting, right? So particularly if you are interested in both Eiseley and Dillard, right, or Carson and Eiseley, like, so Carson scholars should see this, Dillard scholars should see this. So there isn't a lot, I mean, I read it very, very quickly. But what was striking to me in both of those cases is, and so this might be a kind of like gender and science studies angle, right? That Annie Dillard was just starting out when she wrote to him, and that is reflected, right, in the tone of the correspondence, because she is a young writer who's asking both for his approval and his public blessing, right? And there's a little kerfuffle about that, because he has this moment of sort of going like, "Dear Ms. Dillard, you are right. You're a very talented young writer, but as provost of the University of Pennsylvania, I just don't have the time to do this." And then later he sends another letter which walks that back, right? So that's interesting to see. And but the interesting contrast is Carson, who at the time of their correspondence was at least as famous as he was. But she too is giving him the same kind of deference, right, that Dillard does. And so there's this very interesting gender dynamic in that correspondence. And of course, he's very respectful, right, and friendly, but like they absolutely do the kind of "I bow before you, great man of science," right, "Hail, Loren Eiseley" thing. Which I was a little taken aback by, because I thought, why is Rachel Carson striking that tone with him? But that leads into another section of the archive that I thought was interesting. That is really one of the things that I discovered that is of interest to me in sort of ongoing scholarly research interest, and that is that there's a lot of material in this archive that is from periodicals. Like the Saturday Evening Post and Scientific American, and from newspapers, as I said, the Philadelphia Inquirer, a number of others. But also, so there's a lot of periodical and newspaper material that I had never seen, and which I thought was quite striking and interesting in terms of his later career, right, as a kind of sage on the stage. And also, and this makes me feel really stupid, because one of my fields is literature and broadcast media, right? There are a ton of scripts for his television appearances, and also for episodes of TV that he wrote the script for somebody else for, right? So where he wasn't the narrator, but he wrote the script. And that seems really important to me. And I haven't seen, I mean, you all should correct me, but I haven't seen anybody deal with that material in particular, the television. And like, this is Eiseley at the height of his public fame, right? And so I just sort of kicked myself because, there's like a whole box full of that material. And so that seems really significant for a number of reasons. I mean, for me, it's significant because it shows, like, unlike the moment we're in, it shows how, the scientist who's a public intellectual can really intervene, in the way we think about human evolution and the human future and the human past, and also like our place in the ecosystem in terms of deep geological time, and on and on and on, right? I mean, like, people were really listening to him in multiple media. And so that was striking, right? So the letters, the TV scripts, the periodical material, some of which I had never even heard of. And also, so finally, it was really striking to me because I don't do this kind of scholarship, but if you were the sort of person who wanted to track the development of a manuscript, right? One of the things that is very well preserved, which was stunning to me, right, is that there are whole folders that just trace the development from handwritten yellow pad, right? So like he scratches the rough draft of the essay into the yellow pad, and then somebody like makes a first typed version, and then that typescript is corrected and then retyped. And then in many cases, especially if the material wound up appearing in the Star Thrower anthology, which has its own half box of materials, you then also get the galleys from the publisher, right? And I've honestly never seen a collection where those layers are so well preserved and are so readable, right? So if you were the kind of person who wanted to trace the development of a particular piece of writing through its stages from handwriting to revised typescript to galley, right? I mean, you could easily do that. That could be a whole project. And so, I'm going to check, but I think that's actually, those are the main versions of what really struck me. Yeah, so like, why don't we stop there and see if people have questions or comments?
I'm not sure how I can formulate this. So you're talking about seeing the development of his writing from one place to another. Does that include watching his ideas progress in what you, I mean, of course we see that from his writings, but did you see something else? Like a journal or something where he might have jotted an idea down and then.
Yes, there are definitely sort of handwritten scraps, right, where there are ideas. But one of the striking things about this is that, at least from the material I saw, there's really just a 1, 2, 3 done kind of feeling. Like he tended to, from what I saw, he tended to produce an entire handwritten version usually on a yellow pad first, right, from beginning to end, and then he goes back and he edits that by hand inside the yellow pad, right? So that's to go to your question. Mm-hmm. That's a kind of development process that could definitely be tracked. But then there's another layer of that, because once he edits the handwritten part in his own handwriting, then there is a first typescript, right, which then gets edited again, right? So there are layers of editing and revision, which then wind up leading, in many of the cases, to a galley print, which winds up corresponding to the thing that we actually read in the books, right? So that's what I mean. I mean, in terms of tracing his thinking historically, like through the books, you could definitely do that too, right? But it would be more direct to just do that with the books.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean, like there's a lot of deep stuff. I mean, just to compare it to something that I've seen before, like if you go to the Bronte archives, right, the Brontes wrote in almost completely illegible script, and they did that on purpose so their father couldn't read what they were writing. But as a result, like if you're working with a Bronte manuscript, right, you have to have a magnifying glass, and you have to consult other people who know the handwriting better, right, and all of that stuff. I mean, you just get stopped at step 1, right, at the first handwritten version that is available, right? And then that takes a million years. Whereas here, right, it's easy enough to read his handwriting so that you could, if this is the sort of thing you wanted to do, you could trace the development of an individual manuscript, right? And there are dozens of those that you could do that with, right? So I'm not that kind of scholar, but if you wanted to do that kind of thing, it would be easy to do.
Did you notice if any of the handwritten edits were by somebody else? I'm thinking either Mabel, his
Mabel.
wife, or Carolyn, who's probably the typist. I'm guessing he had his secretary do the typing, but
Yes.
I just wondering if you could tell that.
Well, you've put your finger on what to me is one of the great unanswered questions, right, of this collection, which is, to what extent were Mabel and Carolyn co-authors, right? Like I mean, it's obvious that they were editors, right? Like before the press editors got there, like because they were the typists, they were obviously also editing as they went, right? But to answer your direct question, Tom, because I wasn't actually there to look at that issue, right? I only looked at a few of those examples, right, in the way that you're asking. And it looked to me like most of the revisions were in his handwriting, but I don't want to commit to an answer because I didn't do an exhaustive study of that, right? But that's a really interesting question. And it actually relates to like the next point I wanted to make, but I want to, before I make that point, I wanted to see if other people wanted to get in on this part. Are we okay? I will proceed. So the other thing that I found really intriguing, and this is the Christmas card part of the presentation, is that you can really see, right, once he dies, that the archive changes in ways that, of course, you would expect it to. But there's like a whole box of business correspondence between Mabel and the presses and TV stations and like basically all of the entities and, and UPenn, right? All of the entities that he was involved with, right? That have outstanding legal issues, right? With the estate. And so, if somebody was doing a kind of biography where the end game, right, if you want to call it that, is important, right? There's a ton of stuff where Mabel has taken over, dealing with those entities, and so there's a lot of correspondence back and forth about rights and about remuneration, and all sorts of kind of biographical details that a biographical critic would be really interested in. So there's definitely that. But then on a more personal level, right, the Christmas card that I think is the actual physical end and the chronological end of the archive is part of the correspondence between Mabel after Loren's death, the correspondence that Mabel continued to have with two women that Loren himself had been corresponding with, and these are two Dominican nuns in Washington State. One is named Janet Moore, and the other, who I didn't ever find her last name, but she's referred to as Sister Benedicta. Like it appears that this correspondence started a few years before he died. And they write back and forth, and they're writing about, like, they have questions about Darwinian evolution and interpreting it, right? But when he dies, the correspondence between, like, it's clear that they became friends with Mabel as correspondents as well. And when he dies, the correspondence with Mabel continues. And one of the things that was super striking to me is that up until that moment in the archive, she is most often referred to as Mrs. Loren Eiseley, right? And then suddenly, in this correspondence between her and the nuns, right, she becomes Mabel. And I think that I think she lives 8 years after he does. And in that time, there's an active correspondence between Janet and Benedicta and Mabel. And it becomes quite touching. And actually, I have to admit that like one of the physical dangers that I posed to the archive was that as I was reading the end of those letters and cards, a lot of them are Christmas cards. Like I started to cry, you know, and I was like, I can't cry on the archive, so I had to like push myself away from the desk and then come back. But I was really struck, right, that her voice as a writer really emerges in that correspondence, uh, and um, and you really get a sense of who she is when she is talking to Janet and Benedicta. And I just found that personally fascinating. I've never seen anybody deal with that. I'm not sure whether anyone has written about that part of the archive, but it's definitely there, and could be very interesting to write about in and of itself. Perhaps as a larger project of trying to figure out from the archive exactly which roles Mabel played and when, right? Because obviously she had an outsized role, as did Carolyn Workley, you know, so there's a lot of that stuff to be untangled. So does anybody want to talk about that part? Because there is some more, but I just wanted to pause in case people had comments or questions. Are we okay? Okay. So I think that the last thing I want to say about the contents of the archive is that there were newspaper clippings that were preserved from the moment when the Star Thrower is posthumously published, and various newspapers and journals take it upon themselves, right, to assign somebody like it's not an obituary, obviously, but it's sort of like a posthumous review of his entire career. And I remember reading some of that material, which has been published and is accessible, like when I was in my 20s. And it was really striking to me that the material, like now that I'm like becoming a cranky old scholar myself, the material reads really differently, and it reads really differently to me in the following way. I gave it a lot of deference, right, when I was a graduate student, but now I look at a lot of those pieces and I think these people did not even understand what he was saying. Right? I mean, I just sat there kind of agog, you know, going, this one doesn't get it and this one doesn't get it, and like one of them just completely says you should never read any of his poetry because it's no good, right? You know, which is a judgment that I absolutely do not agree with. And you know, and like there's a lot of dismissiveness and a lot of huffing and puffing. And even when he's characterized as like our generation's Thoreau, I really feel like that's a way in many of these articles and posthumous reviews, that's a way of saying like, I don't really know what to call it, and so I'm going to call it Thoreauvian, which is not wrong, but it's also not an exhaustive description of what he did, right? And it's certainly not
so I would say somebody should do a list of every author who's been called our contemporary Thoreau, or there must be hundreds of them.
Right.
Annie
right.
Dillard and
Annie
Rachel
Dillard,
Carson
right.
would definitely be two there. And Abby, you know, the list would go on and on and on. It really doesn't. It's like, yeah, you're right. I feel like I need to say something, but I really have no clue what to say. So I'm just going to compare him to the great man.
Yeah, and it was real. I mean, honestly, it was just personally, it was really upsetting beyond the fact that as a scholar, I think it's just wrong. But I was like, the last thing that happened was that he got dismissed out of hand, right? As this kind of relic, right? A lot of that language, for those of you who've seen this, I'm sure this is familiar, right? A lot of the language in those reviews is like, well, you know, he's the last, it's almost like he's part of the disappearing Indian trope of modernism, right? Like he himself is now like the great man is now going over the horizon, never to be heard from again, right? No longer relevant in our modern times. And I just think that's ridiculous. And so, so one of the things that I wanted to say to you as the society was that I do think that there's still some work to do about recovering him, you know, in a contemporary framework that actually does justice to what he was really trying to do. Because I just thought, I mean, I remember, in my 20s, I was like, that's not what I think, but I guess these people must know what they're talking about. But now I just think they didn't know what they were talking about at all, and they didn't even understand, and they just got it as an assignment from their newspaper editor.
I remember being really disappointed when the eco poetry anthology came out, which is in some ways really great, and I've taught it a lot, but it did not include Eiseley. And I thought that was just a massive oversight not to include Eiseley. And that's one of the reasons I chose to write my article on Eiseley's as an eco poet that I put in that anthology, because I just thought it was a massive oversight.
Yeah, agreed. And I also think that if you kind of historicize that reaction, right? Like in 1977, when he died, formal verse was totally in eclipse, right? And he loved form, although of course there is some free verse. But even free verse is a form, right? If you handle it that way. And so I just think that like that assessment got made at the moment when his method of writing poetry was like the most uncool it would ever be in terms of American sensibilities. Whereas now we have whole schools of neo-formalist poetry. Where I mean, not to speak, like you said, Tom, not to speak of new forms of nature poetry and eco poetry, where he really does fit. And so there really seems to be a need to recover him, as a legitimate poet. Because if he gets taken seriously, it does tend to be, right, as an essayist, right, or as a historian of science, or any of the other roles that he took that mostly involved prose. And weirdly to me, I'm in my own mind. I mean, I have to work this out in my head, right? I'm a very slow thinker when the important stuff comes up, so this is going to take years for me to think about. But it seems to me that like the misjudgment of the poetry is also connected to the way the multimedia stuff has disappeared, right? Because television, of course, is not what you made your literary reputation on in the mid-20th century, right? But there's a case to be made that he was really right on top of the development of what you might call nonfiction television, like not nature documentary itself, but certainly shows which try to explain nature in the atomic age, right? Which is, of course, related to what Carson was doing too, right? So there are a lot of connections to be made that just need to conceptually move beyond those weird stereotypes, right? That landed right on top of the star thrower. And I just thought to myself, if you understood the star thrower at all, why would you couldn't ever write those descriptions. So that actually goes to the point of like what, and this is, I wanted to hear from the group in this sense, like there's obviously a recuperation effort that is needed to sort of put Eiseley back into the conversation about mid-century American literature and media, right? But also, right, new developments in 21st century thinking about like the age that we're in, because of course he has a lot of that thinking. Like he didn't, and so this is actually why I went to the archive, right? That I'm trying to think about what we would now call the Anthropocene, or any of the other terms that are used for the human age, in which, right, the ecological crisis arises. I mean, he and obviously a number of other writers were really talking about that long before the word arises in geography and geology, right? So it just seems like there's work to do there about placing him back into that conversation and that lineage, as someone who is telling us that the age we're living through is substantively different, after World War II, basically. And I actually think that change is visible in the archive, right? Because if you're interested in using the archive to track, for instance, his paleontology, right? Of course, there's a ton of stuff. Like it's really a literal treasure trove, of all of the scientific papers that he wrote and the conversations that he had and the journals that were involved. right? But then after World War II, the character of the archive really shifts into the kind of thinking about deep history and its relevance to the contemporary world that we actually think about when we think of Eiseley as a popular author, right? So I think the archive is sort of sparking all of these connections in my mind about what needs to be done that I haven't had a chance to sort through yet. So I would appreciate any advice that any of you have about any of those topics, really.
Seems like it's time for a new biography, an electoral biography of Loren Eiseley there. You're not busy, are you?
Well, the funny thing is that I'm not a biographer. I've never been a biographical critic, and so I completely agree with you, but I'm totally not the person for that job, right? Like I really think we need an intellectual historian or a historian of science or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I feel like Gail Christensen missed some of this stuff. He was more interested in the sort of day-to-day details. I think he missed some of the bigger picture. I also think he started to take a kind of dislike to Eiseley, which I suppose is a danger writing a biography of somebody. You might
Really, like what gave you that?
Well, he really didn't like the way his politics turned towards sort of
Ah.
very conservative at the end there. I don't know. And he calls him out for that first letter to Annie Dillard. He says it was kind of rude and kind of,
It was.
Yeah.
No, it was
But
rude,
it just
right.
as I read the biography, I got the impression that here's somebody who starts out really admiring this guy and wanting to write enough to want to write a biography about him, but then slowly deciding he doesn't really like the guy that much, but he's too far into the project by that point to back out, which, you don't have to like somebody to admire their work or, think it's important or anything like that. So, but I feel like Christensen wasn't clued into these kinds of larger questions like the Anthropocene issues or that kind of stuff, and Eiseley's thinking on these.
Yeah, it would be great if somebody, even without trying to write a book, even wrote an article that got the ball rolling in that direction, right? A kind of redeeming of Eiseley. And I think that there's a way. As a victim of early onset cranky old man myself, I'm maybe a little more sympathetic to the crankiness than he is, but I also think it's a genre issue, right? I think it's a mode and an aesthetic, right? So one of the things that I'm toying around with, right, is that I'm trying to trace the Anthropocene issue by using the aesthetic of the Gothic, right? So my hypothesis, which I'm not done figuring out, right, but the original hypothesis was the Gothic is the aesthetic cue, right, that something is being said about what we would now call the Anthropocene, right? That kind of pessimism or panic or melancholy, all of that stuff, which in Gothic writers who are known as Gothic is just taken for granted, right? Nobody bothers to call Edgar Allan Poe cranky. It's it's just obviously there. So one of the things that's striking to me about the bicentennial article that he wrote is that while everybody else is basically, because there were 32 prominent Philadelphians who were asked to write a blurb about America for the July 4th issue of the Inquirer, right? Everybody else is basically kind of going, America, heck yeah, and that's completely understandable. It's the bicentennial. But he very notably says, from an anthropological perspective, we know that civilizations don't last forever, right? And so he's kind of writing the obituary for the United States on the bicentennial, which to me is kind of hilarious. But he's going back and forth and saying civilizations don't last forever, but actually we're a really young civilization, so we can't tell where we're going yet, right? And this contrasts very interestingly to me with other sort of scientific sages as public intellectuals, like Carl Sagan, who is considerably to his left politically, right? Where Sagan is saying, right, in that book, The Candle in the Dark, his whole point is the barbarians are about to take over the United States. Like that was his reaction to Reagan, right? And that's understandable, especially given where we are now. But interestingly, that's not really what Eiseley was saying. So I just think there's a lot to be done there.
Yeah, I've always found Eiseley's politics worth investigating, and I think that those of us who are admirers of him have tended to avoid it a little bit. And I think it changed over time as well. I think it evolved. And I mean, his dislike for the counterculture is just palpable in everything he writes, even
Right.
though that was probably his biggest audience. You know, like I was with long hair hitchhiking across the country with a copy of, you know, The Night Country in my backpack, you know, like, and he would have totally hated me at the time, I think, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's fascinating that like as soon as student protesters started to throw stones at buildings at Penn, right, that's where he got off the train. You know, and if indeed he hadn't gotten off before then, there's definitely a sense, right? I've always thought there's a sense where he resents the idea of young people who have so much more than he does, that he did at their age, right? Trying to destroy the thing that is so precious to him, although I don't think that's what they were doing.
Yeah, I think he misunderstood the counterculture for sure.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
but no, I do think there was a kind of, well, I've always thought he felt a little bit like a poser in the academy. You know, what's that term for? I can't remember the term that they use for, like, you know, you're from the middle or lower class, but you're passing in the upper.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I always felt like, I think he felt like that because in a way, well, he came from fairly modest circumstances, you know, and rose to a very high position in the academy, and always felt. And I think when students started questioning professors, when they started doing evaluations, I can just imagine what he would do with his student evaluation. He'd just throw them in the trash can, right? The idea that students would do that was just beyond him, you know. And I have to say, the older I got in the academy, the more I sympathize with that, with that approach there. But that whole kind of questioning of the professor, I think, was something that he found threatening a little bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that there's a lot to say about that, and a way that, like, in the moment that we're in, we could actually, because now we're distant enough from the 60s, I think, to, you know, to be able to have a more moderate tone, right? When, like, so he doesn't have to necessarily be the angry old man who doesn't get it all the time. Even though, like, I agree with you, he was super, super conservative in some ways. But I also want to turn that, because this also has something to do with the archive. I think that's also the moment when a lot of the kind of urban animal life material appears in the essay. So, like, speaking of that, like the brown, I was shocked, right, because I'm also a compositionist, right? I was shocked to find out that the brown wasps is one of the top 20 most taught essays in composition classrooms in the United States. Like, even still, and so that's one of those, you know, for people who haven't read it in a while, right? Like, that's the, like, following a wasp through the urban landscape essay. And then there's, you know, there's the cat. Like, the nice archivist was very interested in Night Country, the cat, who's named after the book. And so, like, even as he's getting more conservative and crankier about humans, right, he's writing and focusing personally more on, like, rescuing stray cats and taking them home, right, and writing about the wasp and all of that. And I mean, of course, then you get to the star thrower, and all that stuff, like, immediately connects into the poetry as well, of course, right? There's all that animal content in the poetry. So, you know, I just think that we're ripe for getting Eiseley back into the mix and reevaluating his contribution. And the archive certainly could be part of that if we had better access to the materials.
Yeah. Yeah. You when you were discussing that earlier, I was thinking about how Sue Mar and I, you know, what part of the idea for the Artifacts and Illuminations collection was to try to make Eiseley more relevant to the contemporary, conversations in the field, the academy. But what was funny was the University of Nebraska Press usually does a great job on covers, right? They get all these awards and their covers are usually really fabulous. They sent back a cover that was 70s retro.
Oh no.
And Sue and I both, but I don't want to,
No.
we want to be agreeable editors of this book, right? But we both thought, no, that's the opposite of what we want. We don't want to like market him as a 70s author. We want to market him as somebody who has contemporary relevance there. But it was funny that for some reason their cover person picked up on that and decided that was the way they were going to approach it. So we said, no, we want another cover.
I love that cover, and I'm so glad you intervened, because their first attempt was apparently a nightmare. Like, oh my God, no. I also want to say that, like, I think it would be interesting for us to consider as a group, right, who is interested in Eiseley now already? Because it's clear from what the archivist said that people send lots of questions to them, particularly about some of the personal details, and especially about the animals. So apparently the Night Country, the cat, is like a big source of inquiry. And he made me go back in, right, and like point to the part of the archive which is really Carolyn Workley's essay in the Prairie Schooner issue, where we know that the cat was named after the book and not vice versa. So which is what you would expect, but still she just comes out and says that. And I would also say that, like, if we looked at that issue of Prairie Schooner plus Artifacts and Illuminations, right, we might be able to sort of start plotting a course forward, like what is there to say next, given that all that material still exists. Although I don't know how many people actually know about that Prairie Schooner issue or are able to read it. I don't think it's been reprinted anywhere, has it?
I think the University of Nebraska Press has reissued it.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
can actually buy
Yeah,
it.
I think so. Yeah. I could.
Right, but still you have to know that it's there.
Yeah, you have to know that it exists. Yeah.
So should we open it up to general questions?
Anybody have any comments, questions, observations?
Yeah, I had some thoughts in this last cycle of discussion, that one of the things that seems to me that relates to a lot of what was being said there is that really Eiseley defies summary. And part of the reason for that is because, like so many things, you can view something in a simple way, but it's never that simple. And that's especially true of Eiseley's work. Like, for instance, a lot of things talk about conservatism, or the whole thing about the bicentennial commentary. One of the things that really permeates a lot of Eiseley's work is long view, which is beyond human time and even beyond human existence, really. That is really a scientific perspective. And it's something that very few people outside of science really get familiar with. You're talking about the Anthropocene, and that's, for example, regardless whether Anthropocene is the right term for that or anything, but
Right.
But this long perspective really is vital to a lot of his poetry, many of his essays, if not all.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I tell people who are thinking about climate change, for instance, that they should read him, right? Because he can teach you to think that way, in like to a degree that I think is unusual even among his peers, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody talks about the problem of, like, how can human consciousness and public communication about climate change, penetrate, like past the immediate moment, right? And so there are definitely people like Eiseley who have done that work already and can show us, like, at least a few models of how it can still be done. So I completely agree with you.
I think one thing that's relevant about him too in that regard is that his academic field of study tended to be the end of the ice age. So it was in fact a period of intense climate change, and he was looking at the effects of that on human development and extinctions of animals and things like that. So he's actually working in a period of climate change. And then of course he's writing at the beginning of how the Anthropocene is usually defined, right? Right. His career spans that. So he's watching it take place around him and noticing it far sooner than a lot of his contemporaries were.
No, I mean, I believe it's from 1952. There's an essay from Scientific American that he publishes about this. And I thought to myself, damn, that was fast. You know, I mean, like he's really right on top of it. And you know, the atomic bomb really shifts something in his writing and in the discourse, and he's like way at the cutting edge, right? So like he's right there with John Hershey's Hiroshima, right, reporting in the New Yorker, and later in the book. So you know that's also something, like speaking of the beginning of what we normally think of as the Anthropocene, right? Like the atomic weaponry issue, right, also factors into this. But I agree with you, Tom, like all of that stuff about the Ice Age and the fact that like he was actively questioning why we weren't going back into another Ice Age, right? Like that reads completely differently now, of course.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he was sort of early in his career anticipating that the ice would return, right? Because we were in these cycles. And, you know, the theory is now that the reason it's not returning is because we've completely screwed up the climate, and we might actually be in a worse situation in terms of the climate were we not in one of those glacial cycles there too. So it's all speculation, I suppose, but it still ties closely in there. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, so that's the direction I'm starting to think in too. Can I answer any other questions about the archive for folks? Okay, well, if you ever want any more information about the Christmas cards, right, or about the amazing bison hunt illustration in the Ice Age that I posted to the group, that's just amazing. Like I really want a reproduction of that image. So
you should come out here and we can take you out west somewhere all that stuff happened.
I would love to do that. And in fact, I've been once, but it was decades ago.
Right. You were to Lincoln once, weren't you? Yeah, decades ago. But not out Scottsbluff area and Wildcat Hills. And yeah.
That would be super fun.
Yeah. All right.
Absolutely.
We'll keep that in mind. Yeah.
Please do. Yeah. But also keep in mind getting somebody to write a grant.
Yeah. I will be in touch with you about getting the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities on it, because it's not my area and I'm retired and I don't want to take on the primary, but if I can get them interested in it, then I think we might be able to make it happen.
Yeah, and I would be happy to be the liaison between the archive and the initial contact with the archive and them, if that's the way it should go.
Okay.
So yeah, we should definitely talk later.
All right.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for listening to me talk.
Yeah, thanks so much it was very informative and interesting. And
yay. Well, hopefully more to come.
Yeah. Okay. We'll stay in touch. Shall we say goodbye here, guys?
Yeah.
Right.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
Thanks
Take
so
care.
much.
All right.
Happy Sunday.
Yeah.
Best everyone.
Bye.